Thank you very much, Jason, and I want to thank Columbia University and Niskanen for putting this wonderful event together. At this time of deep political division and at least some days political chaos, I am offering this big, sober solution to address some of our country's greatest challenges. For years, Americans have been frustrated with our country's insufficient transportation infrastructure. In Westchester, Kendall, South Dade, the Florida Keys, and all across our land, people waste away a significant portion of each day stuck in traffic and separated from their homes, their families, and their pastimes. Traffic congestion costs our economy billions of dollars each year while diminishing quality of life for the average American. Roads and bridges must be repaired and rebuilt, public transportation networks expanded, and airports modernized to secure a prosperous future for our country. The current administration has called for an ambitious infrastructure investment program, and Congress's response has been lukewarm at best. Another major concern for many Americans, especially among younger generations and those who live in coastal communities, is the reality of rising global temperatures, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather caused by the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. While there are still some deniers out there, most Americans today understand that climate change caused by human activity is a reality that must be addressed. I remind my conservative colleagues who often decry our nation's growing debt. Saddling young Americans with a crushing environmental debt, meaning an unhealthy planet where life is less viable, is at least as immoral as leaving behind an unsustainable fiscal debt. While I think alarmists contribute little to the advancement of this cause, I do believe the time to act is now. Already, my constituents in South Florida are experiencing the effects of higher sea levels with chronic coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion in the Everglades, which threatens our drinking water supply. Also, ocean acidification is damaging coral reefs and threatening the livelihoods of fishermen and charter boat captains. So all of this is why I'm filing the Market Choice Act, which recognizes the cost of carbon dioxide emissions while at the same time repealing the regressive discriminatory gas tax, which overburns Americans who drive traditional vehicles and fails to fully fund our nation's infrastructure needs. Specifically, this legislation would achieve the following, and I know we'll discuss more in a few minutes. First, the bill would set the United States on a plan to reduce carbon emissions and not only fulfill but exceed the commitments set out under the Paris Agreement. According to the study from Columbia University that we will be discussing today, the $24 per ton price this bill would set on carbon with an annual 2% increase plus the consumer price index would result in 27 to 32% reductions in carbon emissions by 2025 and 30 to 40% reductions by 2030. Second, the bill raises much-needed revenue to modernize our national infrastructure, a bipartisan priority that remains elusive without a new influx of revenue. Under the gasoline tax, the Highway Trust Fund is projected to receive $407 billion over the next 10 years. Our bill would provide an additional $285 billion, along with an additional $18 billion for the Airways Trust Fund. This robust investment in American infrastructure will result in reduced travel times, improved logistical efficiency, and economic growth. Third, the bill would eliminate regressive, inefficient, and discriminatory taxes like the gasoline tax and the aviation fuel tax to capture the entire economy. While the gas tax disproportionately affects those of lower and middle incomes who can't afford higher efficiency vehicles like Teslas, our bill promotes equitable treatment for Americans driving traditional cars and ensures all Americans are contributing their fair share to our country's infrastructure needs. Lastly, the bill creates long-term regulation stability by establishing a moratorium on the EPA from finalizing and enforcing Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, thus providing much-needed regulatory certainty for utilities and businesses and limiting the economic repercussions of additional regulation. Trade partners will be held accountable by way of a border tax adjustment, a concept advanced in the past by the Speaker of the House and the Chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means. And American exporters will be held harmless to protect their competitiveness. Additionally, there will be more certainty for workers and business as a result of the rolling moratorium on the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. Lower-income Americans will be protected from higher utility bills, and assistance will be provided for displaced workers. In addition to all of this, modeling shows that under this policy, emissions reductions will exceed the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. I truly believe that one day this bill or legislation similar to it will become law. We simply owe it to every American, and especially to younger generations, who are understandably concerned about the future. In the short term, it will spark an important debate about investing in our country's infrastructure, the way we tax, and what to do to protect the environment from the perils of human-induced changes in the climate. While those invested in the depressing paradigm of bipolar politics will dismiss it summarily, many others will offer constructive criticisms and helpful ideas. Let us begin that discussion now. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. Just want to start sort of at a high level and then go into some of the details of the bill. Just talk to us at a time, I think it's fair to say, maybe a little bit of an outlier in the Republican Party prioritizing this issue. Before you get to the details of this bill in particular, talk about how you came to prioritize the issue of climate change. This may have something to do with the district you represent. Why is this important to you?
Well, it's a little bit of everything. Obviously, for us in South Florida, this is a local issue, and we are experiencing the real life effects of a changing climate, saltwater intrusion, higher sea levels. We all live pretty close to the sea and just about at sea level. So it really is a local issue for us. But I think this is a time in politics where people in both parties really need to take risks. I think a lot of Americans are rightfully questioning whether this two-party system can meet the country's needs. And as the two parties are pulled further and further apart, I think we need people in both parties reaching toward the middle and really trying to rescue our political system from fully lacking the trust and confidence of the American people. So that's why I decided to engage on this issue in what I believe to be a meaningful way.
And what brought you to the carbon tax as the best way to address this issue? It's, I think, also maybe fair to say that new taxes are a little bit of a third rail, at least since Bush 41 said, read my lips. And there was a previous version of the Scalise resolution sort of condemning a carbon tax. You had supported that. So what's changed?
Well, in a vacuum, any tax is detrimental to economic growth. If we just ask about any tax that we could levy or increasing a tax without any other consideration, sure, that would lead to lower economic growth and would burden Americans. And that question has traditionally been asked in a vacuum when that resolution has come to the House floor, which is why in previous years Republicans unanimously supported it. But now, because of our work on this legislation and because of the work of many others in the room who have been advancing similar ideas, more and more Republicans understand how carbon pricing could fit in the context of, in this case, infrastructure investment, tax reform, and of course, take into account the economic benefits of fighting climate change and mitigating the future, the forecast of what climate change could mean to areas like South Florida and many others throughout the country.
And so you say you see change happening more and more. It was only a handful of Republicans who didn't support that resolution this week. So talk more about what indications you see that things are changing and maybe both public and private, the kind of conversations you see people having and how you see things moving on this issue.
Well, again, change in Congress, Congress lags society in just about every single way. And I think the founders probably intended that to be the case. So it's in part a criticism, but also just a recognition of the type of government that that we have in our country. And going from a place where there was unanimous rejection, knee-jerk, reflexive rejection to the idea of carbon pricing, to having 7 Republicans on the House floor refusing to support this resolution is significant, because we had those 7 who went on the record, but there are many others who are reconsidering their position, who asked me many questions in advance of this vote, and who are increasingly going to be willing to take political risks for the cause of good policy. To
Can we get some names?
Protect. Well, not right now, but certainly we're seeing trends in the House that should give us all hope. The fact that 43 Republicans have joined the Climate Solutions Caucus, recognizing that climate change is real and that Congress has a role in addressing it, this is significant. The critics, the cynics, will say, well, they've joined this caucus, but look, they voted against this resolution. And sure, that's important, but the fact that now they can be held accountable and that they can be asked to reconcile their participation in a caucus like the Climate Solutions Caucus with their voting record is important for this cause that I think all of us here believe in. So I'm encouraged by what we see. Obviously, all of us would like to accelerate this process, but we're certainly moving in the right direction, and that's something to be satisfied with.
And you'll introduce it later today? And
yes, later today.
Co-sponsors?
I will not be the only sponsor of the bill. We're still in discussions with a number of offices. This is broad, complex legislation. How many we have today, I'm not sure. I know that there are many who are interested, and in addition to the ones we'll have today, I think you'll see more before the end of this term.
And talk about how you think this bill, coming at this time, can help to contribute, hopefully, to a more constructive dialogue on the climate issue. What do we need to do to have that? And not just on the Republican side of the aisle, your thoughts on what Democrats also need to do to make sure we can have a more constructive dialogue across the aisle?
Well, what we tried to do was find the intersection between good policy and the political energy of the moment. Going back to the 2016 election, I think there was one issue where Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton agreed, and that was infrastructure investment. If you look at polling, it's extremely popular. Most Americans, especially those who live in areas like South Florida, understand that there's a great need in our country and that we're falling way behind when it comes to infrastructure investment. So that's why we not only filed, or we're not only filing a carbon pricing bill, but we're also filing an infrastructure tax reform deregulation bill. So we wanted a product where everyone could find a big win for them and for their constituents. And sure, there's some risk-taking involved, but we encourage Republicans and Democrats to look at this model and to consider getting behind it because, again, major priorities for every member of Congress can be found in this legislation. The President of the United States over and over again has called for massive infrastructure investment in the country. I really believe this is the only way this administration will achieve that goal. So that's why we decided to go this route. I respect some of the other models out there, the dividends models. I think there's a lot of value to those, but we thought that at this time, given the consensus around infrastructure investment in our country and just the long-term challenges to the Highway Trust Fund, this was the best solution.
I was going to ask about some of those other models out there, Baker-Schultz, tax and dividend, tax swap. So it sounds like you just elaborate on what you think of those, and it sounds like it's a partly in not just policy design, but a political consideration that leads you to the design you've come up with.
That's right. And again, there are a lot of different organizations out there who have done wonderful work looking at different models based on science, on policy, and we borrowed from a lot of that, so we're grateful. But there are political realities, and the bottom line is we wanted to introduce legislation that brought together some of the leading political interests of the moment. So tax reform, we just went through a major exercise in the House. We know that it's an important issue, especially on the Republican side of the aisle. Deregulation, a lot of people have credited some of the deregulatory work done by this administration for the economic growth we're seeing. There is an element of deregulation in this bill, and of course, for environmentalists, the cause of saving the planet, of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and securing a future for all of us.
So I did want to just take a minute and talk about some of the design features of the bill, and then open up to questions. I see a lot of economists I know in the room who would tell us that there are many externalities related to driving. The U.S. has relatively low gasoline taxes relative to lots of other European and other countries. So why repeal the gasoline and diesel excise tax?
Number one, this is a tax that was designed to fund the Highway Trust Fund, and it fails to do that. And clearly, there are not the numbers in Congress today to advance an increase in the gas tax. And even if we did increase the gas tax, we know that it would only be a short-term solution because, thankfully, vehicles are becoming more energy efficient, more fuel efficient, and some vehicles use no gasoline, which again is also good news, but it poses a problem for the funding mechanism of the Highway Trust Fund. And secondly, I do believe that the gasoline tax is unfair and discriminatory. There are a lot of Americans out there who cannot afford the most efficient vehicles. There are a lot of Americans out there who cannot afford electric vehicles, and although we have policies in place to assist them, oftentimes it's not enough. So I think that everyone who uses our roads and bridges should be contributing to our country's infrastructure, including the wealthy businessman who plugs his Tesla into a coal power plant. So this is why we thought that this particular part of the bill would be attractive to those who support tax equity and who believe in everyone paying their fair share.
And so, the details matter. When in general, people can support a price on carbon or a carbon tax, and then you get into the details. And so we'll have a couple on the panel of environmental groups and ask this question, I'm sure, of them. But the bill has targets for emission reduction to make sure that the price is actually doing what people hope it would do and what some of the modeling shows it would do. And it also removes EPA's authority over stationary sources, clean power plant, that sort of thing. Talk about the decision to marry those things up, and that's something that comes up a lot. If we got national carbon pricing legislation, what impact that would or should have on the regulatory authorities that agencies currently have?
Well, we wanted to be sincere. One of the major goals of this legislation is obviously to reduce CO2 emissions. And that's why we put this mechanism in place where we do have the rolling moratorium as long as the goals are being met. We also didn't want people to have an excuse to oppose the legislation because they would claim that, well, you're deregulating with no guarantees. The guarantees are there. If the carbon pricing model doesn't achieve its goals, we will keep the regulation in place. Now, we happen to be very confident that we will not only achieve but exceed our goals because all we're doing is accelerating a process that is already underway in our economy, which is this transition to clean energy. We have to accelerate that process because the risks of not achieving our clean energy goals soon enough are dire, are very serious for the planet and especially for communities like mine that are so exposed to the changes in the climate. So that's why we put that mechanism in place. And again, all of this was the result of a lot of input. We met with many environmental groups, we met with corporations, we met with experts, and this is the product of many months of input, of feedback, and of hard work by people in my office. I want to particularly recognize Hector Arguello, who has made this his baby for many, many months, and the many friends and partners in the outside that assisted us.
So lots of outside engagement with your colleagues on the Hill, experts, companies, stakeholders. Have you talked to the White House about it, and what's their reaction been?
We had some conversations with the White House about this model, and they were interested to the extent that it was a means to fund their infrastructure investment proposal. So no firm commitments, no deep conversations, but now, once the bill is filed, I certainly intend to take it to the White House and to have a more formal conversation.
And you said that you see movement on the Hill, you see your colleagues sort of, privately, if not publicly, kind of engaging on this issue more. I mean, nonetheless, we did have overwhelming, I think maybe there were 7 who didn't support it, something like that. Support for the resolution condemning a carbon tax this week, and some Democrats also, a handful, supported it as well. So it seems unlikely this bill will pass. I think that's not a criticism. I think everyone probably agrees with that at this moment in time. So the question I wanted to ask you is kind of your view of the theory of change on this issue, right? At this moment in time, doesn't seem likely, but how does that change moving forward? What role does this bill coming at this time have in that? And what role do all the other stakeholder groups you mentioned have in trying to facilitate that?
So we go back to the carbon tax resolution. For many of my colleagues last week, this was still a question in a vacuum because we had not yet filed our legislation. It had just become public that we had the intention of filing this kind of legislation. Once this is filed, once more members have the opportunity to analyze it, to study it, to get feedback from their communities, you're going to see more movement away from that reflexive, knee-jerk reaction to the idea of carbon pricing. And what I would encourage everyone out there to do, not just environmental groups, but every citizen, every American, is encourage both Republicans and Democrats to work together on this issue. If you care about the environment, if you care about climate, any issue you care about on Capitol Hill, it's probably going to require bipartisan support to get done, whether it's immigration, environmental policy, whatever the issue is. If we want to see progress, if we want to see an improvement from the status quo, it's very likely that you're going to require bipartisan support. So hats off to all of the environmental groups that are genuinely and sincerely committed to growing bipartisan support for climate action in Congress. Those groups that are exclusively focused on advancing the interests of one party or the other are making their goals, whether it has to do with environmental policy or anything else, secondary, and that's just a recipe for failure. So I would just encourage everyone to continue engaging. We've seen extraordinary progress since 2015, which is my point of reference. That's when I arrived on the Hill. At that time, there were maybe 2 or 3 Republicans who were willing to openly discuss climate change and to recognize humans' role in climate change and Congress's role in addressing it. So from then to where we are now, we've seen great gains, and we just have to keep doing what we're doing. I have no doubt we'll get to the place where we
Have you also seen a shift
in
in some of the way the major energy companies are thinking about engaging on this issue?
Certainly. We have met with energy companies, with oil companies, with utilities, and all of the conversations have been constructive, and that's a very good sign.
So we have time for a couple of questions. I know the Congressman has limited time. We have a microphone we'll pass around. If folks could briefly identify yourself and keep your question brief. There's a question from the gentleman up here, and then there was one over here.
Thank you, Representative. I'm Mitch Hescox, the president of the Evangelical Environmental Network. And truly, you are one of the bravest Americans, and I celebrate you for that this morning, so thank you. My question is, you indicated it earlier that removing the gas tax would remove one of the most regressive impacts on the poor. Could you explain some other things that are in this bill that would ensure, how much of America of low income would be protected from any kind of regressivity in this bill?
So thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for being a constructive voice in all of this. 10% of our revenues under this legislation are specifically designated to help lower-income Americans. We know that we will see in some parts of the country, especially higher utility rates. We dedicate significant funding to offset those increases so that those families that are most sensitive to changes in utility rates are protected. In addition to that, we remind everyone that the poor are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. For wealthier people, if cost of living goes up too much in a certain area, say a coastal community like mine, you just pick up and move to another part of the country. Lower income people are not as mobile. So by taking care of the planet, we are first taking care of the most vulnerable amongst us. And I often cite my own faith when talking about this issue because I just think we have a moral obligation to protect God's greatest gift to humanity, which is planet Earth. So that's what we do to protect, and not just lower-income Americans, but we also created a fund to protect displaced workers. We know that any time we get drastic changes in our economy, whether as a result of trade or as a result of efforts like these to change the way we tax, that could affect people. Some people could lose their jobs. We have a fund in place to help those individuals get retrained and find other work.
And just to remind people, we modeled those questions like that as part of the analysis of the bill, including the distributional impacts. Nearly all of the bottom 20% end up better off because of the use of revenue, and so you can find that in the analysis, the summaries online that we did with colleagues at Niskanen, the Baker Institute, Tax Policy Center, Rhodium Group. And I did want to acknowledge and thank Noah Kaufman, our senior research scholar at Columbia, who leads our carbon tax research initiative and organized and put together a lot of the research on all these topics. There's a question over here. Yeah. I think the microphone's coming around to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, Harrison Kramer with the National Journal. I was wondering if you think that Republicans might be willing to discuss this a little bit more openly after midterms. I know political pressure might be a little bit more acute now versus later.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think as the closer we are to an election, the less risk members want to take. But we will be having many one-on-one conversations with members. We'll obviously be sharing this with all the members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, giving them the opportunity not just to support the legislation, but to weigh in, to offer their ideas, to share their concerns. This bill is open for amendment. This is not a leave it or take it bill. So, yeah, I do think that in the next few months, members will probably be more reticent to take risk. But once the elections are behind us, we will have a new opportunity.
Question in the front row.
Thanks. James Osborne, Houston Chronicle. Other Republican congressmen who've addressed this issue have had difficulty, have been voted out of office. I wondered if you've seen any sort of blowback out of this, and if that's a concern for you going forward.
I think any time that you take a bold step or file a meaningful proposal, there are risks associated with that. But if I'm not taking risks, I don't want to be in Congress. I'm not here to pass the time. I think the challenges that we face are too great and too grave to just take a pass and sit in the back row and figure out when I'm going to vote yes and when I'm going to vote no. I have not seen any significant blowback back home. On the contrary, I think most of my constituents are going to appreciate the effort to try to contribute to the conversation, to try to find common ground. The easy thing to do these days in politics is to read from the two old scripts. In this case, the Republican script is no, we're not going to focus on this issue at all. We're not going to introduce any new ideas. That's just unacceptable to me. I think we all, it's incumbent upon all of us, as we see the trust and confidence in our institutions continue to erode, to show the American people that we can advance reasonable solutions that will leave every American better off. If there are risks associated with that, I'm more than willing to assume them.
We have time for maybe one more question, if there are any. If not, okay, one last question over there.
Hi. Mark Trumbull from the Christian Science Monitor, and I'm just curious your view on how a carbon tax would affect the economy. The modeling, I think, shows a small bit of damage to economic growth, but do you think, given the environmental impacts over the long term, do you view this actually as helping economic growth?
Well, look, the bottom line is that if we want to undo the damage that is being done to our planet, there's a cost associated with that. And we have found a solution that offsets some of the costs associated with that, a lot of it with economic gains in the form of modernized infrastructure, a taxation system that is more equitable, that discriminates less against the most vulnerable. So we had to make some tough choices, and that's kind of my approach to all of this. When we undertook tax reform last year, I was always for revenue-neutral tax reform because I was willing to make the trade-offs that were necessary at the time to achieve that. Our Senate colleagues decided to take an easier way out and create $1.5 trillion in deficit spending in order to achieve it. I thought that was unfortunate. With this bill, we're being honest. I mean, we could recommend more debt to alleviate some of the costs associated with this. I won't do that because, again, I think that's as unfair to younger Americans as leaving the environmental issue unaddressed. So yes, there are some costs associated with it. The modeling and the analysis is sincere and honest about that. But the greatest and the worst cost of all would be an unhealthy planet where rising generations of Americans are deeply stressed and have trouble living in parts of the country like South Florida. So yes, we have to make an investment, and this bill is sincere about that.
And I'll just remind people again on that question of what the economic impacts are of a carbon tax in general, this broader series of research papers we've done, and the takeaway from that is it really depends what you do with the revenue, and you can see a bar chart in there showing the different uses of the revenue and what the impact of GDP is in an out year relative to no carbon tax policy, and you sort of need a magnifying glass to see the differences in the height of the different bars. And as the congressman, I think, said, that sort of doesn't account for the costs of climate change if no policy is put in place to avoid those impacts. Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank our partners again at Niskanen, and Congressman Curbelo, thank you for
Jason.
joining us today.